Hello everyone and welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to be continuing our Google Play Game Services series and we're going to be writing everything from scratch. So this tutorial is going to be covering the authentication method. I have done a previous video in this series on setting up a project completely, but we didn't write any code in it, and I think it's important that we understand what we're doing so that you can implement this in your own way in your own projects. If you're new to my channel, I do tutorials on everything related to Unity. And I also have a Discord server that is slowly growing, but feel free to come check that out. In here, you can contact me directly, ask for code help, if you get stuck on any of my videos, just have general chats, post your pets, see pictures of my pets. It's a great time. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to be doing is we are going to go into our build settings and we are going to change our platform to Android. This is because we are going to be pushing this onto our Android phone later. And also, I think you get some errors if you import the package before you do this. So we'll do this as our first step. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're going to jump over to GitHub and we're going to pick up this Google Play Game Services Unity package. I'll put a link to this one in the description of the video, but you're going to be jumping into current build and you're going to be downloading this package here. I've already got this package on my desktop, so I'm just going to drag that one into my project and just accept everything. Okay, now that that's done, we should have our little Google Play Games folder here. Next thing we're going to do is create a new folder, and this is going to be housing our scripts. So I'm going to call that one scripts. Okay, now that that's done, we're ready to start creating our scripts. So I'm going to create a C# script, and I'm going to call that GPGS Manager. This one here is going to house all of the logic of authentication and really everything related to Google Play Game Services. In my scene, I'm going to create a game object, create an empty, and I'm just going to call that GPGS Manager. I like to have these managers as individual game objects in the scene because as the scene gets more complex, it just makes a bit more sense to be able to find them quickly. Before we actually start writing any code for this, I think it's important to understand what we're doing so that we can adapt this class in future instead of just copying the code line for line. GPGS uses the process of configuration, initialization, activation, and finally authentication. You can think of configuration as a container that stores some optional flags. These flags tell Google Play what consent will be required down the track. An example of this could be requiring the user to provide an email address or consent for saved games to be stored on the cloud. The second step is initialization. This will take the configuration that you have set up and initialize it into the Play Games Platform class. The third step is activation. By calling activate, it ties together the Play Games Platform class and the social.active class, which is important because all the authentication methods come from social.active. Finally, we can then call the authentication method, which is going to use all the configuration that we've set up and prompt the user for the consent that we've determined we'll need. Authenticate also has an action which allows us to capture the result of that authentication and do some logging so that the client knows whether it's authenticated properly or not, or gives you a reason for why it's failed. This might sound a little confusing for now, but you'll see that once we get through the code, it really isn't actually that complicated. So we're going to open that one up. And inside of here, there's going to be a few things that we're going to be using. We're pretty much only going to be working in this one C# script today, but we'll be building upon them in future tutorials. So we're going to be adding Google Play Games. We're going to be adding Google Play Games.basic API. We're going to be adding Unity Engine.ui. And we're also going to be adding using Unity Engine.social platforms. We're going to add a few variables that we'll be needing. The first is a private Play Games client configuration, and we're going to call that one client configuration. The next thing we'll need is a public text element, and I'm just going to call this one status text, and another public text element that I'm going to call description text. Now we're going to set up the configuration method. So we are going to create an internal void configure GPGS. So inside of our class, we are going to say that client configuration is equal to a new Play Games client configuration. We're going to use the .builder method. And inside of this method is where you're able to define all the things that you would like to add to your configuration. If you don't define this, it will just set them as false and it will exclude it out of the configuration. So for example, I could have .enable saved games as an example, and then I could say .build. And that would then build this into my configuration with I would like to enable save games. In this case, we're only going to be using the most basic method, which is just .build, which is going to set all of those optional configurations to default, and it's just going to build a configuration that doesn't require consent for anything optional. In future tutorials, we will be adding in extra methods as we go, as we start calling these extra services, but for now, we're just going to prove that we can authenticate. I'm going to remove out this update method because we won't be using it in here. And inside of our start method, we're going to configure our GPGS. So we're going to call that there when the game starts. Okay, so now that we've finished with our configuration, the next thing we need to do is initialization, activation, and then authentication. And we're going to handle all of that in one other method. So we're going to call this internal void sign into GPGS. And this is going to take a sign in interactivity. We're just going to call that interactivity. And it's also going to take in a play games client configuration that we're just going to call configuration. So the first thing that we're going to do inside of this method is we are going to say that configuration is equal to client configuration. And then we are going to initialize our instance with play games platform dot initialize instance. And we're going to pass in our configuration, followed by activating it. So play games platform dot activate. And now if you hover your mouse over this method, you can see here that it says this is an implementation of social active. After calling this method, you are able to call things like social activate authenticate. So we're now able to actually call our authentication method. Okay, so we're then going to call playgames_platform.instance.authenticate. And we're going to pass in the interactivity that we've passed into this function. And we're also going to then receive the code. And then with that code, we're going to be performing some actions. So inside of here, you're now beginning the authentication process. So I want to start updating my statuses at this point. So I'm going to say that status text.text is equal to authenticating. And let's put some dots there. And we now want to see if we have actually successfully authenticated. And that's all stored within inside of this code here. So I want to check that if that code has a sign-in status of successful, then I know that I have actually successfully authenticated. So we're going to say that status.text.text is equal to successfully authenticated. And we then want to add some extra logging so that we know that we have actually authenticated, pull the user's name back and stuff like that. And we'll throw that into our description. So we're going to say that description text.text is equal to hello, and we're going to break out of this, and we're going to be using social.localUser.username. So that pulls back the username that the person has, and you have an ID of, and let's just add in the ID as well. So social.localUser.ID. And so that will pull back just a bit of text so we can say, yes, we definitely authenticated. We got the user's ID, and we also got their username. If, however, we get pretty much any other scenario, we would like to know what the code is, and we also want to then let them know that they didn't successfully authenticate. So we'll set the status text here to fail to authenticate, and in our description text, we're going to be setting that to fail to authenticate. Reason for failure is, and we'll then add in the code that they had. So that will now basically allow us to authenticate and let us know when we have successfully authenticated, and then tell us when we failed to authenticate. And now that's the end of our sign-in process. So there was one part of this that I didn't explain, which was the interactivity. Now there are 3 types of interactivity that you can have. If I just type in here, sign in interactivity dot, and you can see that you've got 3 types. So these are enums, and with these enums, they basically do slightly different things. No prompt attempts to silently authenticate the user, so they won't ever see a pop-up saying I'm requesting consent. It will just attempt to authenticate them, and if they hadn't ever given consent in the past, it will automatically fail. Can prompt once is the method that Google recommends to use the most. It will attempt to silently authenticate, so it won't bug the user if it doesn't have to. But if they have never seen the pop-up screen before, then it will bring the pop-up and they're able to accept it at that point. So the process flow for that is generally, if you open up the game, it will pop up with this consent form. If you choose to accept the consent form, you'll never have to see it again because it will just have consent going forwards. And if you choose to say no to that, you will also never see it again, but it won't attempt to authenticate you going forwards. The can always prompt is what we will use on any buttons. That's if like you have a specific button that requests the user to sign in. You always want to prompt them with this pop-up process. This can prompt once. If you deny it, you can never get back to it unless you have this always prompt option. So it's useful to have can prompt once happen at the start of your game and give that user that seamless experience, but still give them the option with a separate button to say, okay, you can choose to sign in if you now decide that you want to. So we're actually going to, in our start method, use our sign into GPGS method and say that we want to have a can prompt once happen here. And then we want to pass in our client configuration again. So we've still configured our app, and then we are going to sign in, and this will happen as the game opens. But we also want to give the option for a user to click a button to sign in as well. So we're going to create a public void sign, we'll call it basic sign in button. And inside of that button, we're going to use this same sign in method that we have here, but instead of being can prompt once, this is going to be can prompt always. So this will always ask the user if they want to sign in. And then we obviously want to be able to sign out, so we're going to create a public void sign out button. And inside of that button, we are going to say play games platform dot instance dot sign out. Nice and simple. And we'll also just give a status update here to make sure that we've got everything. So we'll just call it signed out. And we'll update our description text to just be nothing again. So believe it or not, that's all the code that we're going to need to write for this. So jumping back into our scene now, we're just going to set up the UI quickly. So we're going to create a canvas, just hit F to focus on that canvas. Inside of that canvas, we'll create a panel. That panel is just going to be called sign in. And inside of this panel, we will make a text box. This is going to be a bit quick and dirty, but it's only just to display that it's working. Call this one our description. And in here, I might just put this as size, let's say 50. And just center align this. I'm going to duplicate that element, just move it up here, and call this status. Keep that as size 50 as well. That's our status text. This is our description text. And we will also make a UI. We want some buttons now. So we're going to grab button number 1. This is going to be our basic sign in button. So on the text element of this, we're just going to name that basic sign in. And we'll add one more thing in here, which will be another button. That button is going to be a sign out button. Might just bottom align that one there. Sign out button. And in this text, it's going to say sign out. Might just make this text a fair bit larger. Let's make it 35. 35. And that should be fine. Okay, so that's our scene set up, very quick and dirty. Inside of our GPGS manager, we're going to drag in our 2 status elements. So text number 1 and description, which is text number 2. I'll just drag that one to be above. This is Unity pretty much completely finished. So now we need to set up our project inside of the developer console. If you're unfamiliar with the Google Play console, in the previous tutorial where I did the smoke test, I went into a bit more detail about walking through all the different fields and different areas and things like that. Still from the point of view of setting it up as a test application, but I'll be doing a little less explaining and I'll just click through this to make it a bit faster for this one. If you get stuck though, I would recommend going back and having a look at the other one. So we're going to name this code tutorial GPGS. This is going to be a game. It is going to be free. and I will accept these conditions. Going to scroll down to Play Game Services in Configuration. And in configuration, my game doesn't currently use it, so I wanted to create a cloud project. I'm happy with that being the same name. Okay, now that that's created, we need to create ourselves some credentials. So I'm just going to say configure, and I'll click on this Google Cloud Platform. This link should take me straight to the setup of Oauth consent. So I'm just going to say I'm creating an external one. You won't be able to create an internal one. We'll go create. Our app name is going to be our code tutorial GPGS. Our support email address, I'm fine with that being my email address. Developer email address can just be my Flarvain email address, and save and continue. And inside of credentials, we are going to be creating an Oauth consent. So we go create credentials and Oauth client ID. We're creating an Android application. The package name will be the package name inside of Unity. So I'm just going to jump back into Unity, go File, Build Settings, Player Settings, and I'm going to rename this to Flarvain. And you can see down here, the package name is just com, and then the company that you named it, and the application that you're creating. So it's com, company name, product name. So I can't copy this in the newer versions of Unity. In the older versions of Unity, oh, actually, I can just overwrite it. There you go. In the older versions of Unity, you could just highlight this and take it directly, but I'll paste that in. And now we need to get our Sha1 certificate. I covered this Sha1 in a bit more detail in the previous video, but we're just going to go ahead and grab it this time. You can follow the same steps. It should be the same. I'm going to copy this, and we're going to jump into CMD. Inside of CMD, I'm going to navigate to where my Java folder is, which I believe for me is C drive, program files, Java, JRE, and bin. And inside of here is the key tool application. So we are going to CD to that location. So we're now going to go back here. We're going to copy this, and we're going to paste that in here. The only thing we need to replace here is where the path to our debug key store is. Now, I did mention this in a previous video, but again, if you're using your debug key store to sign this application, which you can find inside of player settings and go down to publishing settings, you can see here it says this application will be signed with the debug key. This means that it's the one that is locally stored on my computer. If I was using a custom key store, I would need to go to the location of that custom key store. Or if you're using Google to sign your application, you need to get the Sha1 from Google as well. But because I'm doing this on the debug, I know where that one is found. So it's this computer, C drive, users, Flarvain.android, and this is the debug.key store here. So we're going to add in that location, and then we just need to add in the key store the debug.key store. Hit enter. It asks for a password. The password for the debug key store is nothing, so just hit enter again, and it will present you with your Sha1. I've blurred this out, but just copy this value here, your Sha1 here, and we're going to go back into this, paste that back in, and then hit create. This gives you a client ID. For now, we'll just hit OK on that. We're going to be using that client ID inside of Unity a little bit later on. But we can go back into here, say confirm configuration, and that should refresh this. We're now going to add a credential. We're going to keep that as Android. The anti-piracy, you will need to have this set to off if you're creating an APK and putting it on your phone directly. If you're going through the Play Store and you have actually published the application, I would recommend turning this on, because it will then only allow people who have downloaded it from the Play Store to be able to use it. The Oauth client is just going to be the one that we created. And we're going to hit Save Changes. We're now done with this, so we can exit this configuration area. The next thing we're going to do is add our testers. So inside of, obviously, testers, and then testers here. It's got my one email address. I'm just going to add my other email address. Add. And then that should be it for our Play Store setup. The only thing we need to do now is jump over to get resources inside of this credentials area, and we're going to be copying this here. So copy that there, and we're going to go to Window, Google Play Games, Setup, Android Setup, and we're going to be pasting in the resources that we got from the Play console. It also asks for our client ID. That's the client ID that was inside of this cloud platform. We can just hit copy OAuth client ID here and paste that in. And in the previous video, we changed this because we had a different namespace. Because we're not using namespaces at all in this project, we can just hit setup and you'll see it creates a brand new script for me. My one actually didn't create a script here because I haven't created any leaderboard information or achievements or anything like that. So we're now going to set up the Google Play Games setup nearby connections. But for that connections, it just wants my package name again. So I'm going to scroll down to where I've got it here, copy it, close that out, and just jump into here and paste that in. Hit setup, and that sets up the nearby connections. Resolve some dependencies, that's always good. And now the final thing that we need to do before we build this game is we need to make sure that these actually have on-click functions on them. So we'll take this from our GPGS manager, and this one was the basic sign in and the sign out, GPGS manager, and sign out button. And then we're going to go to File, Build Settings, Player Settings, scroll down to Scripting Backend and change that to IL2 CPP. Tick our ARM64. This is just a habit I've fallen into. I don't think it's actually needed for my APK, but you definitely need it if you're publishing this to Google Play. It will resolve dependencies one more time. And when that finishes, we're finally ready to build. So we're going to go here, build. I'll just create a little folder here called versions because we're going to say, or we're creating a few. This will just be basic auth, and I'll hit save. This will take a few minutes if this is the first build that we're doing. Okay, now that that one's finished, I've connected my phone up. I'm just going to copy this basic auth and drop it onto my documents, should be fine. Close that down and switch over to my phone. Over here on my phone, I'm just going to open up my files, go to my recent files, install that file there, open it up, and we've got our game. Doesn't look so great yet, but we can see that it's already authenticated immediately, and that's because we had the basic authentication turned on start. And we're then going to sign out. We can see that it signs out successfully, and we'll call one more basic authentication. And this one is an always prompt, so it will always give me the option. I'll choose the account that I want to sign in with, and successfully signs me in again. As always, I just want to take a quick second to thank Flubase Fafi, Patreon that's been with me from the start. I really appreciate you. And if you're interested in supporting my Patreon, you can go over to patreon.com/Flarvain. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video, guys. Thank you.